Thanks, Heather. Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Reshoring, Rethinking Your Global Supply Chains. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Rosemary Coates, thank you for joining us. Rosemary Coates is the founder and executive director of the Reshoring Institute, a 501c3 nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that is focused on expanding U.S. manufacturing. She is the president of Blue Silk Consulting, a supply chain management consulting firm. She also works as an expert witness on legal cases involving global supply chain disputes and has worked on over 60 legal cases. Ms. Coates has been a management consultant for 35 plus years, helping over 80 global supply chain clients worldwide. She's an Amazon.com bestselling author with 5 supply chain management books, including Reshoring Guidebook, 42 Rules for Sourcing and Manufacturing in China, and Legal Blacksmith, How to Avoid and Defend Supply Chain Disputes. Rosemary serves on the board of directors at the University of San Diego Supply Chain Management Institute and teaches global supply chain strategy at UC Berkeley. She earned an MBA from the University of San Diego and a Bachelor of Science in Business Logistics from Arizona State University. She regularly teaches classes and seminars at the University of San Diego, UC Berkeley, and several other universities in the US and Europe. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Rosemary.
Thank you very much, Kate. I appreciate the introduction. Okay, let's get started. We're going to be talking about reshoring and all the things that have been happening in global supply chains over the past few years. So hopefully at the end of this, you'll have learned some new things, and maybe you'll have lots of questions after this. This is me, a little bit more about me. I've been doing this kind of work as global supply chain work for about 35 years now, and have gone through all kinds of aspects of global supply chain management. And that's really helped to put the background and the context of what I'm going to be talking about with you today. At the bottom, you can see the books that I've written. The one on the far right, Legal Blacksmith, I wrote together with an attorney, and it's all about the clauses and information that you need to have in your contracts when you're dealing with global supply chain partners. In this particular book, I wrote the front half of each chapter about the process in supply chain, and the attorney I wrote it with, Sarah Rathke, wrote the back end, which was all the legal precedent. So it's a sort of a handy dandy book, to sort of a reference book for you if you're working in this particular industry. I also have a podcast called The Frictionless Supply Chain, which is hosted by Supply Chain Management Review magazine. And on that podcast, we focus on women leaders in supply chain management. And I write a column for Supply Chain Management Review magazine. The Reshoring Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit and nonpartisan organization, and that's really important. We play it right down the middle. We don't take sides and try to be very objective in our research. We have a dual mission. One is to help provide research and consulting for companies that are reshoring or bringing manufacturing back to the US, and that includes things like how to label your product, made in the USA or assembled in the USA, site selection, finding and redeveloping a supply base in the US, helping set up factory locations, all sorts of things, systems integration. So we do lots of work regarding helping companies to bring manufacturing back to the US and now also to Mexico. Most of our clients, I would say 80% of our clients are interested in Mexico at this point, as well as the US. The second part of our mission is to provide experiential learning for graduate student interns. So we take graduate students from MBA programs and engineering programs, and we teach them about manufacturing, and they help us with our research. They write case studies and white papers and so forth. Today, we are affiliated with 16 universities across the US and several in Europe that I haven't mentioned here, but perhaps you see one of your alma maters here on the list below. And we're always adding new universities as time goes on. So we take interns from these universities and we pay them and put them to work for 100 hours, and they help us with our research. So in the 1990s and 2000s, offshoring was the thing to do. So as a management consultant at the time, uh, most of my clients were asking me to get to China. So they chat a little bit about strategy and say, just, get me to China, find me some sources there, help me set up a factory in China. And so this was the work that I started doing in the late 1990s and became an expert in offshoring to China. I spent lots and lots of time in China. This is a picture, of course, of the Forbidden City. Where in Beijing, where I've been many, many times, and it's a museum, but it's really fascinating regarding the history. This is where the emperors and empresses lived for 500 years. While I was working in China with an automotive client a few years ago, we were expanding their operations in China. And one morning I came to work, and the purchasing manager said to me, "We're going out to see one of our machine shops. Do you want to come with us?" And of course I did. That's one of my favorite things, is to crawl around factories in China. You always learn so much when you do that. So this particular factory, we were working in downtown Beijing, and this particular factory was out at the Fifth Ring Road. If you've been to Beijing, you know there are ring roads around the city that get sequentially further and further out. This one was the Fifth Ring Road, which was about an hour and a half drive from central Beijing. So we went to the factory, and as we got to the factory door, the factory manager met us, and he said he had to take a conference call, but just go ahead and look around. And I was a little surprised by that. I mean, if you've ever been to a factory, you're generally very carefully guided through the factory. You have hard hats very often, toe protection, sometimes goggles, steel, lead aprons. So when you're in a factory environment that may be somewhat dangerous, you have to wear protective equipment, and you're guided through the factory. Well, in this case, the manager said, just go ahead and look around. So you can see my colleagues are here in the middle, talking to one of the machine tool operators. And as we walked through the factory, this little guy on the bottom right is operating a machine tool that's cutting metal. He had no gloves, no goggles, no lead apron, no toe protection, nothing, no ear protection. He was just standing there in those little black cloth Chinese shoes, operating this machine that's cutting metal. And I was kind of astonished when I saw that. I mean, truly, it's a different environment than you would see in most of Western developed countries in factories. So we kept on walking down the aisle, and I'm looking around. Now, this particular factory was a very large machine shop. And to the right, where you can't see here, but to the right, there were about 4 or 5 more bays like this one. It was just an enormous machine shop by comparison to what I've normally seen in machine shops. And the colleagues from my client told me that this was particularly good shop, a very good shop. They were producing very high quality parts. My client was very happy with the quality, and were about to award a very large contract to them. And so they went to visit the factory for that reason, one final walkthrough before they awarded the contract. So this is a representative of a very good factory in China. And even though there were no what you would expect safety regulations that were being followed in this factory, isn't that they aren't in part of the law, they just weren't being followed. Even though that was the case, the production from this factory was very good. Look for the yellow lines also. So if you've ever been on a factory tour, you're told adamantly to stay within the yellow lines. And if you step outside the yellow line, somebody comes and and moves you back into the yellow line. So it's an OSHA and safety requirement. In this particular case, we were wandering in and out of these machines, and it was so different. And at some point I thought, this isn't safe for me. And so I backed up and I asked somebody at the front if I could take pictures. And He said, sure, go ahead, which was again astonishing. If you've ever been in a factory, you know you're not allowed to take pictures, and that's because they're building your IP. And so pictures, cameras are not allowed. Very often, cell phones aren't allowed. And so it was kind of a surprise, but I'm snapping away pictures, and I was really glad I did. Now, the guy in the bottom right operating that machine, after this experience, we went back and researched the cost of machine tool operators. In this case, now this was a few years ago, but the machine tool operator there was making $3.63 an hour. In America, the same machine tool operator job, a very similar or exactly the same job, a person makes $26.10 an hour. In Europe, it's even higher, $32 and change per hour. And so the cost comparison was very stark. And the reason why I bring this up is because this is what we've been told over time, that the labor rates are so cheap in China that it makes it, really advantageous and economically to move your production there. But that wasn't the only thing. It was also the very low cost operations, the inability to enforce safety regulations, no safety equipment. No, there was no heat or air conditioning in this particular facility. So all these things are cost savings and make the overall cost of the operation less. So that was a few years ago, but what actually happened and was prior to that was during the 2012 presidential elections. I think this was the catalyst for the reshoring movement overall. So way back in 2012, people may think that reshoring only happened the last few years after the pandemic, but in fact, this has been ongoing for 10 or 12 years now. During this particular presidential election, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama are both China bashing like crazy. They're both saying all of our economic woes are China's fault, and there are human rights issues, and there's currency manipulation, and on and on and on. And they're going over and over and over again talking about all this stuff. And I'm thinking, man, I can't tell anybody what I do for a living because I was helping all these companies offshore to save money. So out of that, though, I think really sparked conversations. So I started having conversations at the C level with organizations that I was working for about the potential for manufacturing in the US. So I had a CEO come to me and say, is it even possible to manufacture in the US anymore? Is it possible economically to do it? So what we did is we put together a methodology for evaluating the potential possibility for reshoring. Um, and out of that grew the Reshoring Institute. So we actually developed the institute at the university. We incubated at the University of San Diego and then went nationwide about 3 years later. But this was really the spark that led to the beginning of the reshoring movement. Over the past few years, major things have happened. So I love this picture. Look at the little sharks along the bottom. This is the way it feels in supply chain management now. And, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, it was nothing like this. People would ask me what I did for a living back then, and I'd say supply chain management, and their eyes would sort of glaze over. They're like, oh, let's move to the bar. But these days, supply chain management is front and center, headline news in the Wall Street Journal every day. I mean, this is a big deal. And not only have supply chains been completely disrupted, but now there's so much risk involved that was never there before. First thing is long global supply chains have increased the risk. So every time you have a different link in the supply chain around the world, you have a potential point of risk. We didn't deal with so much of this long global supply chains until the early 2000s when we started doing a lot of sourcing in China. Geopolitics certainly a factor, and that changes all the time. Right now, there's certainly a threat that China, well, that China will take over Taiwan, and I would say it's not if, it's pretty much when. I think that's bound to happen. And so that creates a risk for anybody sourcing products from Taiwan, particularly semiconductors from TSMC. Geopolitics in Ukraine, the geopolitics of the war on Gaza, all of these things disrupt supply chains around the world. The trade wars that were started under the Trump administration, that were not only putting additional tariffs on imports from China, pretty much everything coming from China has a 25% tariff on it. So as you're importing goods into the US, you have to pay an additional 25% of the value in tariffs. But trade policy also was disrupted between our two countries. And today we still have the imposition of tariffs. In fact, yesterday, the Biden administration announced even additional tariffs coming or being put on Chinese goods being imported into the US. The rise of global counterfeiting. This is a terrible problem all around the world, to the tune of about $4.3 trillion on average. And I'm not talking about watches and purses here. Global counterfeiting is across industry. A lot of industrial products are counterfeited: automotive, electronics, aerospace, and defense. And I think about this every time I get on an airplane and buckle my seatbelt, thinking, oh God, I hope there's no counterfeits in the avionics on this plane. Lean methodologies. I probably most of you are at some level or another are using lean methodologies in your company, and lean is a very popular idea. It's kind of a culmination of a lot of different aspects of improving organizational effectiveness over the last few years. Lean methodology is focused on efficiency, building efficiency, eliminating waste, and policies and procedures that don't add value, and eliminating inventory in your supply chain. So just-in-time delivery for manufacturing and so forth, which was not such a great idea during the pandemic. I mean, because most companies didn't have enough inventory to work through the ups and downs of what was happening in supply chain. So that was a big Achilles heel for a lot of companies during that period. The global pandemic certainly woke us up. Now we understand how much risk is in our supply chain management. As I mentioned before, every link in the supply chain is a potential point of risk for your supply chain. Certainly travel restrictions, if you are managing suppliers around the world during that period of time, and if thereafter, even limited travel today, to go and visit those suppliers to oversee what's happening in your supply chain. So that has changed a lot in the patterns of how often we go to China or go to other places in the world that are manufacturing our goods. The war in Ukraine. So that, wow, that's a long way away. And who would have thought? Uh, Oddly that enough, though, it has affected semiconductor production around the world. And that's because about 40% of the world's neon gas comes from Ukraine. And neon gas is required to produce semiconductors. So it's part of the etching process. If you can't get neon gas, you cannot produce semiconductors. You may remember a year or so ago where we had a major global semiconductor shortage. And a lot of that was due to the fact that the Russians had bombed the neon factories in Ukraine. That was one of the first things that they bombed. So even though the war in Ukraine is very far away, that is a major problem in supply chains. And then the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You may not know about the Uyghurs. I'm going to explain that in a minute. The Uyghurs are a group in the far western province, Zhejiang province in China, and we have restricted imports from that region in the US. So the Uyghurs are an ethnic group in China. They're more Turks and Arabs related culturally than they are Chinese. And so the Chinese government has decided they wanted to re-educate these people in the Chinese way of life and governance. And so they have put all these Uyghurs into labor camps to re-educate them. And essentially, they are prison camps, and they are forced to work in factories as a result of that for very low wages. Now, the U.S. government has taken a very firm stand since 1920, so 100 years. We have not allowed forced labor or prison labor products to be imported into the U.S. We have strict law against that. But we've taken it even a step further under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We have taken a stand that we will not allow anything coming from Zhejiang province, nothing, unless you can prove that it is not made by forced labor. So essentially, our stand is guilty until proven innocent, just the opposite of what you would expect. So we've taken a draconian step to avoid any Uyghur products that are coming. Now, this is a problem because there are many things that are made in this province. Textiles, apparel, footwear, cotton is a major product there. Electronics, TV remotes. Almost all the TV remotes used to be made in Zhejiang province. Automotive parts such as airbags, base metals, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, all these things were made in that area, and we have restricted the imports on those products. Now, U.S. government has said if you can prove that there's no labor, no Uyghur labor in your product, then we'll allow it to come in. Otherwise, we're going to presume there is Uyghur labor. And the other thing is the Uyghurs are bussed all over China. So they may be bussed to a factory in on the East Coast, to the big factories areas such as Shenzhen or Dongguan or Guangzhou. And they're forced to work in factories in those areas. If the US government determines that there is bussed-in Uyghur labor in those factories, they disallow those goods as well. The other thing they're doing is DNA testing. So if there is cotton grown in Zhejiang province and that cotton is sent to a textile factory somewhere else in China to produce a textile, and then the textiles are sent to another factory to produce, say, men's shirts, and the men's shirts come into the US, they test those products for DNA of cotton that's grown in Zhejiang province, which is a surprise. That's a lot of heavy testing, but that's what U.S. Customs is doing now. And if they find that the origin of that cotton is Zhejiang province, those products are disallowed. So this has caused, as you can imagine, a huge disruption in the apparel industry worldwide. So why are companies reshoring now? Well, certainly the mood of America has changed. Generally in the world, countries are now looking inward and would prefer to buy products that are made in their home country. So it's kind of the whole idea of building locally has gained popularity and is sort of the centerpiece of a lot of the politics that we hear about now. The Tax Reform Act of 2017 under the Trump administration reduced the tax rate on manufacturers from 27 or 28% in the US down to 21%. And the idea was that that was going to force all these manufacturers to come back because they were taxed at a lower rate. And what actually happened? Nothing. So most of the companies just pocketed the difference in the tax savings, or they paid out bonuses, or they invested in some other way. But it did not drive a lot of manufacturing back to the U.S. Now, worldwide, the tax rate for manufacturing is 24%. So we are actually below the worldwide average. So that makes it look good for U.S. manufacturers, but it isn't driving manufacturing back here. The 232 tariffs and the 301 tariffs, 232 tariffs are on aluminum and steel. 301 is on all Chinese goods, and these were imposed under the Trump administration, and they are still in effect today under the Biden administration. Certainly, the global pandemic scared a lot of people, and there were companies that couldn't get parts, and were really struggling, and that drove this idea of rethinking your global supply chains. Advanced technologies, definitely. So, as we advance in making products that are using new machine tools and artificial intelligence and 3D printing and all these sorts of new technologies helps drive efficiency and drive down cost. And then there's the three big favorable legislation. So the Infrastructure Act, these were all passed under the Biden administration. So the Infrastructure Act, which focuses on rebuilding infrastructure in the US, roads, bridges, ports, airports. The Chips and Science Act focused primarily on semiconductor production, and the Inflation Reduction Act and Sustainability Act, which has a lot of funding for green energy involved. All three of those are infusing billions of dollars into the U.S. economy, and they're all focused on helping rebuild manufacturing. And then the enhanced enforcement of the various legislation that was already in effect. So, for example, if you were a government buyer from the government purchasing office, and in the past, you had these acts that said you were to buy goods made in the USA before you looked outside of the US to buy something. Most buyers would go for the least expensive part. So they may be looking at a part made in the US versus a part made in India or China or somewhere. And it was much cheaper to go overseas, so they would buy the overseas part. I mean, after all, they're spending our tax dollars, right? But those laws have been newly enforced, and now there is much more emphasis on buying in the US and doing a total cost of ownership evaluation. So, considering the cost of the product, the logistics costs, the delays, and so forth. And it makes buying things in the US much more attractive. The other thing that's happened is the annual salaries of production workers have changed. So, all this stuff, we can make comments about what happened in the past, but you always have to refresh this for what's happening right now because things change so much in the world. Look where China is on this chart. So, what we did was we looked at the Reshoring Institute, we did a major world salary survey, and we looked at 10 different job categories for 12 countries. And this is one example. So this is production workers or machine operators worldwide. And remember, I told you before that machine operator in that factory was making $3.63 an hour. Fast forward to today, just a couple years later, and their salaries are now doubled. So China is now smack in the middle of the countries that we looked at. It is no longer considered a low-cost labor or operations country. It is more expensive than most of the other countries in Asia and around the world. So on the bottom right, Mexico, India, and Vietnam are lower cost countries than China by far. So when companies are deciding where should they source or manufacture, China is no longer an economically viable place. What about medical device manufacturers? So in 2023, Geometry did a survey, and that's the old ThomasNet. If you remember, if you're in a buying situation, you may remember ThomasNet. They're an online sourcing group, and their parent Geometry did a survey. And so they asked about trends in medical device manufacturing. And here's some that were very important. Additive manufacturing, also known as 3D printing, because it's fast and efficient. Injection molding. Most injection molding for plastics was done overseas. And now we're seeing some of the molds themselves are being still made in China in particular, where it's economically appropriate to do so. But the final assembly, the actual molding process, is being done in the US. Reshoring is another trend. So 67% of the medical industrial professionals are likely or extremely likely to reshore. This is a very popular idea. And then sustainability, which goes hand in hand with reshoring, because when you shorten your global supply chain, you lessen your carbon footprint. So sustainability and reshoring go hand in hand, and I think it's a winning combination for most companies. So according to Geometry, 2/3 of the medical industry professionals are likely to add American suppliers. So what happens if we start to source more in the US? In 2021, Thomas Net, so that's the company under Geometry, said that 83% of manufacturers are planning to add North American suppliers to the supply chains. Okay, 83% are going to try to source more in the US. So if American manufacturers add an average of 11 suppliers each, so, as you may know, most manufacturers have thousands of suppliers. And if they just add 11 suppliers in the US each, it amounts to $443 billion injected into the US economy every year. I mean, it is absolutely astounding how much effect that has when we add North American or American suppliers. So what products should be considered for reshoring? Certainly anything that can be automated is really subject to the potential for reshoring. And that's because when you have an automated production facility, you don't have to worry so much about the labor costs. Their labor costs are minimized. So for example, if you have a sewing shop, see the picture at the bottom. This is a picture I took of a factory in, I think this one was in Vietnam. And they're making athletic shoes here. Look at all the people who are at sewing machines and hand gluing those little squares on the bottom of your shoe and so forth. Making athletic shoes is very labor intensive, as is apparel. But if you work in a textile factory, so see the picture above that, it's almost fully automated. If you walk into a textile factory, there's maybe one or two engineers walking around, and that's it. So the labor is very different in these areas. So if you have a product that includes a lot of labor, like apparel and footwear or electronics assembly or making toys or anything that's high touch, those are likely to stay in a foreign location. But if you have a product that's automated production, then you have lots of options. And that includes things like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, textile production, plastics. So you need to know your cost structure when you're buying things. What's the cost structure of the product? And where are you likely to find suppliers? So rethinking your global sourcing and manufacturing strategy. There's so many different variables that go into the decision now that never was before. So now most companies are doing a strategy that might be like China plus one. So keeping some manufacturing in China, certainly to serve the Asian market or in other Asian countries, plus one other country. So maybe China plus the US, China plus the US and Mexico, China plus two strategy, finding more domestic sources, building inventory so you don't get caught like we did in the pandemic with no inventory to build your products. There's so much to consider: geopolitics, pandemic risk, climate change, logistics costs, all these things that we really didn't consider much in the past. Now they're coming to the forefront and are part of the decision. Okay, the US-Mexico border. So a lot of manufacturing is coming back to the US, as I mentioned, but much more of it is going to Mexico. And that's because the overall cost profile in Mexico is very low. The labor costs are very low. The operational costs are certainly cheaper than the US. And it's often a China plus one strategy. So if you were manufacturing in China or sourcing in China, you now move that to Mexico. And part of it also is because under USMCA, which is our trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the US, you can bring in those products duty free. So, as I mentioned before, we have tariffs on Chinese products at 25%. The same product being made in Mexico comes into the United States duty free. So, there's a cost advantage and also a proximity advantage. The growth along the border is astounding. So right now at the Reshoring Institute, we are have a study underway that is on cross-border commerce, and what we're finding is just amazing. So I was down at the Laredo, at the border at Laredo a couple months ago. I took one of our interns down with me, and we had a look around. Now, Laredo is now by volume the largest U.S. land port in America. So just think about that for a minute. It's a little town on the border of Mexico, but it is the largest U.S. land port in America. They process 14,000 trucks per day. Now, I couldn't believe it when they told me that. We met with the economic development people and the bridge people and the customs people. And I'm like, I can't be 14,000 trucks a day. You know how many? I mean, that's just astonishing. And I've seen a lot of stuff in my career, but I was really surprised. So they took us up to the International Bridge and we watched for a while. And what they have done is the US and Mexico together have built these long corridors. So the trucks slow down to about 20 miles per hour and they go through this electronic corridor. In that corridor, the truck is weighed and scanned to make sure there's no contraband in the back. The truck and trailer are both barcode scanned to make sure those are the ones that we're expecting. The driver has facial recognition, so they know it's the right driver coming through. They weigh, as I mentioned, and it takes about 14 seconds for each truck. Then that information is matched up with pre documentation that's pre-entered into the system. And if it all matches up, they sail right on through. They never stop. They never talk to anybody. They just drive on through. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing to watch this happen. They told us that the growth rate in Laredo for last year was 238%. Can you imagine? I mean, this is a little town and there are just trucks everywhere, everywhere coming across the border and into the US. And this is a result of the growth in cross-border commerce. So if you're leaving a foreign location, China in particular, it's not as easy as it looks. There are a lot of things to consider. Most Chinese workers are on employment contracts of 1 year or 2 years. So if you decide to close down shop in China, you have to pay out those employment contracts. That's a big surprise to a lot of my clients. They say, you know, we want to shut down part of our manufacturing in China. We're going to lay off 200 people. And I say, well, you have to pay them for the next 2 years, you know. So that's a big surprise. You have to get a permit to leave. Usually there's a wait time, and if the Chinese government thinks you're producing something that is important to their economy, they're gonna slow walk that permit time. It may take a year or two to get a permit to leave. If you've supplied tools, dies, or molds to the factory in China, you're never getting those back. And I don't care what the contract says or how much you stamped USA or property of your company or anything else on that tool, a machine tool, some kind of die or a mold. You're never going to get it back. And that's because the Chinese government won't allow it to be exported and because the factory considers it now part of their infrastructure. IP, the process and technology, you have taught the factory how to build your product, who your suppliers are, the quality standards, all about your product. So you think that if you're going to shut down the factory, the workers are all going to go to sleep at night and forget how to make your product? And no. They're going to come to work the next day and continue to make your product under a different brand or a different label. So you may find yourself competing with your own products on the world market. And then supply-based consideration. So redeveloping your supply base in the US, if you decide to reestablish in the US or Mexico, means you have to redevelop all those suppliers for the factory. And that is a daunting process that can take 12 to 18 months. Here's some examples. This is Water Logic. They make the fill station. So when you fill up your water bottle at the break room or at the airport, they make that kind of equipment. They're headquartered in the UK, and they have a very modern, wonderful factory in Qingdao, China. But they looked at the US as their growth market. They wanted to sell here and also to sell to the US government. So they came to us and we helped them for over a year to find a location to manufacture in the US. And they ended up building a factory near the Dallas Fort Worth airport. And they put about 200 people to work, which was fantastic. And because they were manufacturing here, they avoided the import tariffs from China because they were sourcing and manufacturing here, and they were able to sell to the US government. This is a famous case study for GE. When Jack Welch was running GE, pretty much gutted manufacturing in America, shipped it all overseas. And that was, excuse me, one of the ways he was able to achieve such high financial results. When Jeff Immelt took over for Jack Welch, he challenged the engineers to try to bring some products back to America. And so the first one that they looked at were water heaters. So, most of us have those big round water heaters in the garage or basement. So the engineers went to work and they designed a heat on demand water heater where you turn on the tap and hot water comes out. In order to do that, they had to re-engineer the manufacturing line. The market was in the US, so they wanted to manufacture here. And they ended up negotiating with the unions and reopened Appliance Park in Louisville, which was a big footprint manufacturing site for GE, and eventually brought other products. They make high-end wine coolers and high-end other appliances. Eventually, they put 4,000 people back to work in Louisville. 4,000 people. I mean, that is just astonishing. And some failures. So, I live in Silicon Valley, and part of our culture here is to fail fast. And that means, we want to try new things, and if it fails, then we learn from those mistakes and try again. In these cases, there were a couple of failures in reshoring that I want to talk about because we can learn from these examples. The first one is Otis Elevator. They're one of the big four elevator companies in the world. And they had been manufacturing in Mexico, and they decided to build a new plant in Florence, South Carolina. And they opened the plant, and surprise, they didn't have any workers. So even though there was a high unemployment rate and had machinists and other tool operators in the area, they were not ready to operate the sophisticated kind of tooling that went into this new factory. And they neglected to train skilled workers to operate this kind of equipment. They stumbled along. They also, at the same time, were implementing SAP. If you use SAP, or they're a software company, an ERP system software company. I worked for SAP for 5 years, so I can tell you they have wonderful software. It's really great, but it's very complicated and difficult to implement. So at the same time they were building a new factory, they were implementing SAP. Some genius thought that was a good idea. At any rate, at the end of the first year, they had lost $60 million in business because they couldn't keep up with orders. The CEO was fired, and they stumbled along for, excuse me, for a couple of years. Okay. The last example is Stanley Black & Decker, and they make Craftsman tools. Now, Craftsman is a well-known brand, primarily sold at Sears, and I know my father and my grandfather both used Craftsman tools and loved them. They were like, you know, had reverence for these tools. They used to hang them up and polish them in the garage and all of that. So very well known, very high quality. And the hand tools were hand finished in a factory in Tijuana. So they built a factory. Stanley Black and Decker built a factory in Texas and brought the manufacturing there. And they fully automated this plant. They had all these sophisticated machine tools and all of that. And unfortunately, they opened the plant and they found that the machine tools really couldn't do the kind of hand finishing that they needed for the quality that they expected on these machine tools. It was also during the pandemic. A lot of the automation didn't work. And so they ended up returning much of the production to Tijuana, at least in the interim, until they could get the factory to work. So they essentially closed down that factory in Texas for a while until they could rethink the strategy. Okay, and this is my contact information. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if you want to reach out to me. I would also encourage you to look at our website. It's reshoringinstitute.org. We publish all of our studies, our case studies, our white papers,
White papers.
our surveys, all kinds of things go on to our website, and you can download everything for free. We don't make you sign up for anything. We think of it as a public service because we're a nonprofit. And so I would encourage you to go there and look at all the goodies that are available on the site. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. We do have a couple of questions for you. First, which industries have you seen begin to return to a domestic supply chain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's, funding for semiconductors, and I think that's front and center. Um, we can see semiconductor production facilities being reestablished or being built in Arizona, in Idaho, in New Mexico, in Ohio, in upstate New York. So all of this is based on investment in the US and funding available from the US government. So that's a really high profile. Unfortunately, those factories won't come online for 5 to 10 years. They're big, high, sophisticated, expensive factories. So it'll take a while for that to come to fruition. We're also seeing pharmaceuticals. So you may know that building blocks for pharmaceuticals. So a lot of pharmaceuticals use some standardized chemicals and so forth, and then they add other things to it to produce the end product. But a lot of those building blocks come from China and India. And during the pandemic, we recognized that we did not manufacture any building block chemicals for antibiotics in the US. So can you imagine if the supply was cut off from China? We couldn't manufacture antibiotics because we had no building block supplies. So we're seeing a lot of pharmaceuticals come back because of that, a lot of new factories. Plastics is another one, which is a surprising. But plastics, as I mentioned before, a lot of the molds are still being made overseas, but the actual production is being done here to be close to customers. And part of that is because the industry demands fast turnaround times. And so you got to make close to your customers so that you can deliver as expected.
Thank you. We had a question come in. Is there any information you can provide about programs, grants, legislation that would be helpful in assisting companies who are thinking about trying to reshore?
Yeah, I think so interestingly, all these big funding from the three big acts is all being administered at the state level. So even though it's federal funding, the state has to go and apply for that funding. So if you're thinking about opening a new factory, say in South Carolina, you have to work through the South Carolina government that can then apply for funding through the federal government. So my recommendation is to go to your local or your state economic development people and start there. That's a very good place. And then, of course, we help all kinds of companies with that as well. So we can help. So there are other places that you can go, but then also in the state that you're targeting.
Okay. Aside from China and India, which countries do you consider high risk for supply chains, and what are some alternatives?
Yeah, well, there's lots of high risk places these days. Um, I think Taiwan is very high risk, and you can get great products there. Most of the semiconductors, somewhere around north of 70%, I think, of semiconductors are produced at TSMC in Taiwan, by far the world's largest semiconductor producer. High quality, good cost. I mean, everything about it is good, except that China is over there looming and expects to take over Taiwan. It's part of their cultural history. They feel Taiwan is sort of a wayward son and eventually will come back into the fold. So I think that once that happens, then we're very vulnerable. If we don't have a good relationship with China and they decide to cut off our semiconductor purchases, we're really up the creek. Just think about semiconductors in our lives, and they're in everything. They're in our computers, they're in our phones. I dropped my the cord to my hair dryer on the tile floor the other day, and the little black box that you plug it into the wall kind of split open. And sure enough, there's a semiconductor inside. I mean, they're in everything and part of our lives, our automobiles, everything. So if we can't get semiconductors, we are in bad shape. So I think that's really vulnerable for us.
Uh, are there any creative solutions you've come across that can help companies mitigate supply chain risk while also managing manufacturing costs?
Yeah, so I've been favorable about this and trying to coach my clients for a long time about controlling your global supply chain. So you need to know not only who you're buying from, but also who they're buying from. So a tier two, tier three, tier four a supplier, so that you understand the vulnerabilities at each of those things, each of those places. And that's the way you mitigate risk, is to understand where there are vulnerabilities and then put in policies to protect yourself. And I think, moving products closer to home makes it much easier to manage those kind of vendors. I think that's a place to mitigate risk. It also may have economic effects. So you asked about risk and cost. So the closer you move things to home, the less you have to worry about shortages, about logistics costs, about talking to somebody in the middle of the night about production. So that's risk. Um, I think one of the other areas we used to help clients potentially in Europe to source products in Eastern Europe, because those were low cost countries in Czech Republic and Poland and so forth. But that whole area is at risk now as well because of the war in Ukraine. So, you've got to rethink your global strategy, and it just takes it's the kind of project that we work on all the time. So we'll work with executives to rethink where they're manufacturing and where they're sourcing and where their customers are. What are the cost profiles? What are the labeling requirements? All of these things are part of those projects.
Very good. Well, we are coming up on the hour, so I think that is going to be the end of our Q&A session for today. Rosemary, thank you so much for your time. Supply chains are constantly evolving and remain a significant source of risk for our clients, so we know that your expertise will be a valuable resource for them.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.